So we're going to be moving into our next section here to biology and ecology. And so we've just now gotten the broad view of invasive annual grass and their impacts on the entire biome. While it's a societal challenge, it's rooted in biology and ecology of these species. So let's pivot to talking about how foundational biological and ecological knowledge is useful for developing management strategies. For this, I'd like to introduce Claire and Paul. Again, we've seen and heard a little bit about Claire. She is the outreach program coordinator of the Invasive Annual Grass Tech Transfer Partnership and an assistant research scientist. She helps to plan and implement invasive annual grass workshops throughout the Western US, and she was instrumental in bringing this to you today. Paul is an associate professor of rangeland ecology and management with the State Extension Specialist for Rangeland, Livestock, and Wildlife Interactions with the University of Nevada, Reno. Paul has worked extensively with land, livestock, and natural resource managers throughout the West and continues to do this in Nevada. I will turn it over to Claire to take it from here.
Thank you, Erica. So our first section today, we're going to be talking about the biology and ecology of these systems, and kind of circling back to our principles. We're really going to be focusing on the principle of leveraging ecology, and so that's going to be looking at how do these invasive grasses grow, reproduce, as well as how do they interact with the environments around them, and how do they impact these different ecosystems. And so the kind of outline that we're going to be kind of following today is first I'll be talking about biology, and then Paul will be moving on to ecology. And so what we'll be focusing on in the biology section is looking at the ranges of cheatgrass, ventonata, and medusa head, as well as then looking at the life cycle of these invasive annual grasses and how they relate to management. Because we have so many managers here today, we really want to tie it into how will that impact your management strategies. So first, the three species that we're going to be really predominantly focusing on within this talk is cheatgrass, medusa head, and then ventonata. And then we'll be kind of tying it all in together. And so looking at specifically the ranges of these species, our broadest range is going to be our cheatgrass. You see all the green, those are where it has been reported to be found. And it's pretty extensive throughout the United States. But then when we move over to looking at specifically medusa head, you'll see that the population is a lot smaller in comparison to cheatgrass, and that the range is not as wide. Now, there might be some areas some of you folks are looking and seeing that the different counties are highlighted in green, and sometimes you'll be like, well, how did it jump over from one spot to the next? It kind of depends on its vector pathways, which we'll dive further into later on in this presentation. But other things too is that maybe it hasn't been found in that specific area or reported. And so then lastly, looking at ventonata, you will see that it is like the smallest of all the three population-wise that has been located and found. But still does not make it mean it's not as much of a problem. And so one of the most interesting things that we did look at when preparing this presentation was seeing how much research has been conducted on these different species. And one of them is specifically seeing these three different species and how many results came up. So looking at cheatgrass first and foremost, you'll see that there's over 3,500 different results that were found. But then when you look at medusa head and then ventonata, you'll see that there's a lot smaller results that are found. And I think one couple interesting things to point out when we're on this slide is looking at that within the 1990s for cheatgrass, there was roughly about 43 results that were found. But then in 2023, through the years of up until 2023, there was over 30 results found. So quite the difference. But then when we're looking at medusa head, you'll see that we dramatically drop down in the number of results to 383, and that a lot of those results are found post 2007. And then lastly, looking at ventonata, the most interesting thing was we saw increases in results post 2008, but that we found the most results in 2019 with 53. And that's roughly a little under 40% of the results just found within that year. So when we're talking about these life cycles moving forward, we're going to be focusing a lot more on specifically the cheatgrass life cycle. Why? Well, when you look at this specific graph, you will see that we have so much more information that we have found about cheatgrass. We're still doing lots of research on all these different species, um, but we have the most knowledge specifically on cheatgrass. With that being said, though, we will try to tie in different parts about Ventana Medusa's head, and that they still have relatively the same life cycles as cheatgrass as well. So as I'm going through this life cycle, I really want everyone to think about, what does it mean for you as a manager? How does this impact how you're going to go about things? And so first, we're going to dive into looking at specifically germination. So some of the things to consider when germination of like information that we do know is, so the seeds really like hot, dry conditions, and that is required to break dormancy. And cheatgrass seeds, about 90% of them will germinate within that current year, but there still will be some that will remain within that seed bank. And when I'm referring to the seed bank, I'm meaning the top few inches of the soil where the seeds will remain dormant until they find the right conditions to germinate. And the last thing I want to point out is it is really important to know that cheatgrass, like a cheatgrass stand, can have multiple germination events. And since seeds are the predominant factor that continue to allow these species to reproduce. So what does this mean for you as a manager? It's the one thing I really want to point out is that timing is going to be variable from place to place and year to year. And a prime example of this is in Pinedale, Wyoming. The local folks had said, we don't really find many fall populations at all. We have never really seen it. And so then there was a couple of researchers that came out and they found that was not the case, that there was a lot of fall germination that was occurring, at least in the year that they were going to be putting out their treatments. And so what would that mean for you as a manager? Well, one key thing is to keep really good records and continue to watch from year to year if that is feasible for your group. Because then you know how things are shifting and changing. And the last thing I want to point out specifically is that your timing is going to matter. It's going to matter when it comes to your different types of treatments, the types of treatments you choose to do, but knowing that it will shift from year to year based on different variables that we'll talk a little bit more about in the ecology section. So then next, we're going to be moving on into the emergence and seedling growth life cycle. And so you'll be noticing that we'll be moving into more of your winter into early spring. Now, there can be emergence within the late fall, early spring. However, a lot of times, if there is some sort of germination within that fall period, what's going to happen is the roots are going to be elongating out underneath the surface. So you're not really going to see any growth during those winter months, but do know that something is happening. And so then once the conditions become right in the springtime, that's a great opportunity for the cheatgrass to then send up shoots prior to even any of the native perennial species being ready for germination as they remain dormant, excuse me. And so that's just something to keep in mind, that stuff is happening during those winter months, even though it may look like it is dormant. So what does this mean for management? This is an opportunity because seedlings are very vulnerable. This is an opportunity to potentially be treating. You could potentially do some fall grazing, or not fall specifically, but you could do some spring grazing to help reduce your litter loads. And what I mean by litter is if you look at all the yellow stuff within the photo, you will see that's all stuff that could be mitigated, as well as trying to keep those emergent seedlings at a smaller rate to hopefully try to reduce them from being able to go into seed production and minimizing it. And so then moving on to seed production. So there is a really short window between between maturation and seed setting. So you can attempt to try to graze during that time, but it's going to be kind of hard because of how small that window is going to be. So what does that mean for you as a manager? Well, if you did not stop the life cycle and the plant is able to go into seed production, you now have a new crop of seed that is ready to restart that cycle. So the way I kind of think about it is almost like the shot clock restarts. So you missed your opportunity this time around. So you're going to now have to go back through that cycle because it wasn't stopped. And so that's why, as a potential option, you could try to maybe graze it to try to help minimize the amount of seeds, but we really recommend potentially focusing on your planning. Now is not really going to be the time to treat. You're going to want to really focus on what are going to be your planning efforts moving into the fall and early spring of that year and the following year. Then we move on to senescence. And during this specific time, you're going to notice that cheatgrass turns a bright yellow or a blondish color, and it's going to be before any of your perennial species. So you'll notice that your perennial species will remain in those green colors, while your invasive annual grasses will be turning yellow. This is also when you'll have a very, very high amount of litter production, which will create favorable conditions for then hopefully your seed germination and stuff. And now you do also have viable seed within that seed bank. So what does it mean management wise? You would really like to manage your typo litter, the litter management, to then help make the conditions less favorable for your seeds. So like I mentioned in the way beginning back at germination, we talked about how it needs those hot, dry conditions. And that litter can help provide that for the seeds. And so going through litter management can be a great way to help maybe make those conditions less favorable for germination. Another thing to consider during this time period is monitoring. During your summer months, monitoring to see where your populations are located can be really beneficial for future planning, as well as seeing how your infestations are changing from year to year. Your rates of infestation can change over time. So if you're actually monitoring it, then you can see how those changes have occurred, whether it's your populations have gotten a lot smaller or they've expanded beyond. And then lastly, we're going to be moving into our final stage of seed dispersal. So invasive annual grasses are prolific seed producers, and their seed can be viable within the seed bank anywhere between 3 to 11 years. And so that's quite an extensive period of time for these populations. So for management, one thing you really are going to want to consider during this time is managing your vector pathways. And what I mean by vectors is this could be livestock. You graze various pastures. This could be wildlife corridors as they migrate. This could also be human influenced, whether you're hunting, backpacking, just going on a road trip. Those are ways of transporting seeds, which can be incredibly problematic because then you can move populations to new areas without even knowing it. And so one example of how that some people have tried to mitigate it is actually up in northwestern Montana. They have a medusa head population, and they actually specifically close the road during a few weeks out of the year once the medusa head has gone to seed to try to help mitigate the spread of the seeds and limit that. And so that's just one way of doing it. But another option, potentially, say you're a rancher, is seeing if there's a possibility that you may not be able to maybe not graze in a specific pasture if you know it has tons of invasive annual grasses and the seed has just been dispersed. So then you're not carrying it over to other pastures. So there are some opportunities. This has also been moving into the specific time frame of potentially different herbicide applications. But we're going to dive deeper into that when we get into our management section. So you'll have to hang around to find out more. And so in summary, we are looking, this figure on the left-hand side is everything that I just basically went through. And so what you're looking at is these are the different characteristics that you will see throughout the life cycle of the plant. And then The next portion is looking specifically at different types of management styles that correlate with our diagram. And so when we look at the blue, that's going to be your different types of herbicide treatments. And so you'll notice there's arrows pointing with little blurbs about this would be a great time to apply a pre-emergent herbicide. This would be a great time to apply a post-emergent herbicide. And we'll explain that later on in the day, like I said. And then when you look at our red bands, those are the different times to potentially be grazing as an opportunity to help minimize the spread of these grasses. And so I will be providing a handout. I'll drop it in the chat once I'm done presenting. That'll have these two graphs as well, these two figures, excuse me, as well as a couple other figures that we'll touch on later in the day, just so you have it all in one little packet for you guys. And so, yeah. So, um, so if we have any questions, Erica,
it does look like we've had a question come in for you, Claire. Just 1 minute. Let me make sure we've got it. Yeah. So it sounds like someone is wondering, is it possible to have a bio bullet that targets one specific species, such as a geoengineered fungus that only targets medusa head and not other species?
Currently at this time, we do not have any research on that specific top. We haven't found that being a way of just targeting one species at the current time. But definitely something to look more into, but we'll touch more on that in management as well.
Now it looks like we might have another one that's come in. How fast are invasive annual grasses increasing across the states, and why is it important to monitor annually if you have the capacity?
Okay. So as for the speed of things, I'm not sure on an exact number, but the reason it's important to monitor is to really see how things are changing throughout your landscape. And the other thing that I find to be super important with monitoring, not only seeing how things are changing and progressing, but it's a great opportunity to see also what management tools were working and not working for you, because this is not like a one size fits all for everyone. So that can be super important. And the other thing too is specifically within like different agencies and stuff, you potentially have a lot of turnover. So if you keep good records of exactly what you did, say specifically during your time at that position, it's a great opportunity then for the person that's coming in to see exactly what's been done, to kind of then you're not starting over from square one. You do already have some background knowledge and you can continue to build off that and tweak it as you see fit too.
Perfect. Well, with that, we may move to Paul.
Okay, good stuff. Thank you, Claire and Erica. I had a lot of trouble deciding what to focus in on for 30 minutes under the title of the Ecology of the Invasive Annual Grass Problem. I want to send a big thank you, a big shout out to the other members of the core team who helped me kind of narrow down my thoughts. And I'll just tell you all right now that what I think is the major reason for thinking about ecology relative to this problem is to drive home the idea that we want to make sure that we're all spending at least as much time thinking about how to manage plant communities that either do have or might have invasive annual grasses show up, as we do spending time just thinking about managing invasive annual grasses. So that's really, if you don't get anything else out of the next 25 minutes or so, hopefully that I've made a strong case for that. So with that, I'm going to start off by giving you a little quick roadmap of where I'm headed in the next 25 minutes or so. And I'll provide a kind of a general brief introduction. What is ecology, definition of ecology, and I'm going to stress interactions among organisms and between organisms and their environment and that definition. And then along the ideas of leveraging ecology to defend and grow your core, I settled on four main points, and one of them is the one I just mentioned. So manage plant communities, not just invasive annual grasses. The second one, if we are going to effectively manage plant communities, we need to know our sites. And so that's going to happen at a few different levels, but knowing your site, knowing what you're working with, what you have to work with, and what your options are is hugely important. The third one is this idea that invasive annual grasses really have the ability to hijack plant communities. And those points came through in some of our opening comments. And that's something that we need to respect about these plants. And then finally, there's a tendency, we all have it. I'm right there with you. There's a tendency to oversimplify things down. And sometimes this manifests in the form of, gosh, if I could just get rid of this disturbance or that disturbance, I'd solve the problem. Well, folks, disturbances don't have on-off switches, and so it's not that easy. So we need to appreciate the complexity of disturbance and how it's working in these systems. So that's where I'm headed. Starting off with ecology, what is it? Well, it is a word that has Greek roots that was coined by a German scientist. And it's basically taking oikos, which means home, and ology, which means a study of, putting them together in one word, doing a couple of spelling changes, and ended up with ecology being the study of home. More completely, if we really think about what does that mean, it's the study of interactions. So a lot of emphasis on interactions. So we have some organisms interacting with other organisms, and we also have these living things, these organisms interacting with the rest of their home, the non-living parts of their home, their environment. And so there's a whole lot of interactions that really make up ecology. And all of this emphasis on interactions translates into the importance of processes, to the point where often when you think about ecology, you hear about major ecological processes. And so the ones that are most often discussed are things like energy flow. How does energy flow through the system from the sun, through the plants, and then on through the food chain? How do nutrients cycle in these environments? How does water move through these systems? And so at this point, with 3 of the 4 main ecological processes up on the screen, it's not too hard to see that these processes are driven by plants or processes that are directly related to plants. And that's good news for us if we're, well, maybe for me. I'm the one that's promoting this idea of managing plant communities. And so that gives us kind of an entry point into the system to affect all these ecological processes. Now, the 4th ecological process is even more closely related to plants, and that is colonization and community development. So plant community development, plant community change. I learned this as succession. I tend to like the word succession. If you like it, keep thinking about it. But if that causes you heartburn, just swap out succession for plant community change or plant community development. And so really ecology is looking at all these interactions that are captured in these major ecological processes, and plants give us a point of entry, something that we can focus on for our management. So let's take those ideas. We'll take some of those ecological processes and run through this table here and talk about some general trends during succession or during community development that have implications for management. So down the left side here, we have species composition. That's plant species composition. We have the rate of turnover of nutrients and nutrient cycles. And so we're thinking about how nutrients move through the system. We have the resource acquisition rate, which is how fast plants, for example, are taking resources up out of the soil. And then we have the growth rates of plants. And so going to the second column, if we think about some stage we might have on a site soon after a disturbance, we could expect a whole bunch of short-lived species, plant species. We could expect nutrient turnover rates that are pretty fast. So nutrients become available and then are taken up really fast, kind of pulses and flashy, if you will. And related to that, we have nutrient cycles that are open, meaning there's some nutrients available, they're leaky, and so it's, there's nutrients to be had. And so then it makes sense that the uptake of those nutrients is also pretty fast. And that ability is correlates pretty closely with plants that have the ability to grow quickly. So their growth rate is rapid. Now, then, if we think about a stage kind of later on, after more time elapsed since a disturbance, we tend to have a lot more of the long-lived plants, slower rates of nutrient turnover, nutrient cycles that are closed and conservative, meaning those nutrients are kind of tied up in some of those long-lived plants, and the resource acquisition rate being slower and growth rates of plants relative to the other scenario also being slower. So what this suggests, if communities actually do develop from that middle column to something more like the right column, it suggests that our longer lived plants, slower growing plants can outcompete those shorter lived plants. And one way to think about this is, we have some of these perennial plants live for many years, maybe can outcompete the annual plants. So let's see what this might look like at a site. And before we go to the picture, what I want to say here is when we're managing plant communities, the basic strategy is to encourage the plants we want more of, and those are often the perennial plants, and then discourage the invasive annual grasses. And some people talk about this as exploiting the weaknesses of the invasive annual grasses and really foster the resilience of the perennial plant community. And by doing this, we're actually managing or directing this process of community development. So let's see what happens if we go into a plant community, like where you see all the green. That's a whole bunch of native perennial bunch grasses. We go into a plant community like that and we take out the native perennial bunch grasses. What might we expect? And this is, assuming you've got some of these invasive annual grasses around, and in this case they did. So these researchers went in and took out the perennial bunch grasses in that square patch in the middle of the picture, and look what happened. We took out those longer lived, slower growing plants. We kind of changed the nutrient cycles from being closed and conservative to being more open and leaky, because when we took those plants out, we made available a lot of resources. And what responded? Well, it was the invasive annual grasses that are producing that kind of reddish, purplish color in the patch right there in the center. Okay, so it is suggesting that just what that table summarized. Now let's do a couple more what ifs. What if we went out here where at the end of that yellow arrow, where we've got a mix of those perennial grasses and some invasive annual grasses, and we added a bunch of nitrogen fertilizer? Well, the graph, the table in the previous slide would say, gosh, you'd make those nutrient cycles kind of more like that early stage of community development and maybe favor the invasive annual grasses. Bingo, that's what would happen. We would see an increase in those invasive annual grasses out there. And similarly, if we added water, if we irrigate some of these arid perennial plant communities, we might see an increase in the invasive annual grasses. And on the flip side, if we could do something out there in that plant community to reduce the availability of nitrogen, for example, what might we expect to happen? Well, we would produce conditions that are more favorable to those longer lived, slower growing perennial plants and less suitable for the invasive annual grasses. And I think we'd see that show up in the changes in the plant community. So what we're talking about here is, which plants compete best with invasive annual grasses. And as an entry point, what we really want to do is think about, okay, a lot of this competition is for soil resources. And so two major considerations are where are the roots of the plants of our invasive annual grasses, and what is the timing at which they're taking resources up out of the soil. And our best competitors are going to be those types of plants that have roots in the same zone of our invasive annual grasses and are actively growing and taking up resources at the same time. And so, as we kind of indicated in that previous slide in the picture, if we take our native perennial cool season grasses, and cool season because that lines up the timing of growth and use, the established members of that group, so they've been there a while and they're established on the site, those tend to be very good competitors with invasive annual grasses. And I'll go ahead and extend this to some of our introduced perennial cool season grasses are pretty good competitors with invasive annual grasses. But the seedlings of these perennial grasses don't compete with invasive annual grasses near as well. What about native annuals? I'm going to go ahead and put both of those bullets in at the same time. We have just a few native winter annual grasses so far, that doesn't look like they're that good at competing with invasive annual grasses. If they were, you might ask the question, well, if they're really good competitors with invasive annual grasses, why do we have so much of the sagebrush biome that is invaded by invasive annual grasses? And it's a fair question. Native annual forbs, we need to think about, we have way more of those native annual forbs. But again, we need to think about their root systems and timing of growth. And I left the question marks in there, leaving the door open that these might play a role, these native annuals. If we get the seeding density up high enough, or there's some indication that putting them in the system can influence the communities of organisms in the soil that actually favor some of our perennial plants. So I'll leave the door open, but so far, it doesn't look like there's a whole lot of hope for those to be used on the scales that we've been talking about this morning. And then I'll wrap up with sagebrush and bring in another picture in the bottom right corner. In general, sagebrush is not a good competitor with invasive annual grasses, and that's why we see so much country that looks like that picture in the bottom right corner. So we're talking about managing plant communities, not just invasive annual grasses. So to summarize this part of it up, the basic strategy, we really want to encourage our desired perennial plants and discourage the invasive annual grasses with our choice of management action or actions, whatever that mix might be. And again, some people think about this as exploiting the weaknesses of the invasive annual grasses and fostering or encouraging or increasing resilience of our native and, well, mostly native and but maybe also other desirable perennial plant communities. And by doing this, we're really managing or directing succession or community development. Okay, if we're going to manage plant communities, then it's pretty fundamental that we know our sites. And we need to know our sites on a couple of different levels. So we don't need to get too hung up on these two different maps. One is an earlier version of a map that many of us learned when we were starting to learn about the sagebrush ecosystems, the major sagebrush ecosystems in the cold desert shrublands and grasslands. And then we have a more inclusive map that's come out more recently representing the sagebrush biome. Folks, the point I want to make here is that we are talking about a big chunk of country with a lot of variability in the types of plant communities and rangelands that can be supported. So something that works really well in one part of this map may or may not work just the same in another part. So with the scale of these systems, there's some value in thinking about some concepts that are applicable at a pretty broad scale. And a couple that I think are really helpful that have come out recently and been talked about more and more as we go on are the concepts of resilience and then also resistance to invasion. So resilience is the capacity of a site to really bounce back after stress is imposed on the system or disturbance happens. And a classic example is represented by these pictures here. So if you have a site that burns, for example, and then has the ability to develop to a point that it supports pretty much the same plant community that was there before the fire, that's considered resilience. It has the ability to bounce back. If, on the other hand, fire takes that site to a whole different plant community and a whole different trajectory, then that would be considered lower resilience. Resistance to invasion is the ability to limit the growth of populations of invading species. And so The picture on the left there was not resistant. The whole understory there is dominated by invasive annual grasses, as compared to the picture on the right there, where we have some of the plants we were talking about earlier that are much better at competing with these invasive annual grasses. And so that picture on the right would be a community that's more resistant to invasion. And so some of these concepts are helpful to think about and appreciate the fact that they really vary across environmental gradients. And so, thanks to the folks who developed this nice figure, basically what we're saying is, as you look at the bottom of the figure, we've got that arrow from low to high, and that refers to the resilience to disturbance and the resistance to invasion, along with increasing elevation and productivity. And so, as you move from the lower elevation, warmer, drier parts of the landscape up in elevation to the cooler and moister environments, both the resilience of those plant communities in the face of disturbance and their resistance to invasion tend to increase. And so this can be helpful in, thinking about a huge challenge on a huge landscape. Whole different scale. Now I'm going to zoom way in and say that thinking about the different types of rangelands at a finer scale is also important. So you can think this map kind of in the center, where all the different colored polygons are, is roughly 2,000 acres. And you can think about each different color of a polygon as a different type of rangeland that we know of as rangeland ecological sites, and they used to be referred to as range sites. Those are defined as being distinct types of rangeland, distinct in the manner that they have differing potentials to support native plant communities and also respond to management. And the major factors that influence these are climate, soils, and topography. So, for example, you can have a loamy plains ecological site. So you have loamy soils, but they're in the plains. And that can be a different ecological site from a loamy foothills, still loamy soils, but in the foothills. So climate, soils, and topography. The climate part, you could have like in my part of the world in northern Nevada, we talk about loamy 8 to 10 inch annual precip as one ecological site, and a loamy 10 to 12 is another one. So my main point with this, folks, is just to get it out there and to encourage folks, if you're not familiar with rangeland ecological sites, if you don't have somebody that knows about them on your team, check into it, see if you can get a range nerd on your team who's aware of these ideas, because they might end up being helpful in terms of getting to know your sites and thinking about what to do. So these ecological sites come along with ecological site descriptions, which are like little user manuals for these different types of rangelands. And so again, I just want to point it out and say, these vary across the country and how well and how thoroughly they're developed and how useful they might be to your efforts. But it's worth looking into. It's worth being aware of these and asking your team, do we have somebody that's aware of these and familiar with them? And if not, maybe see if you can find somebody. Another thing about knowing your sites that's good to know is this concept of thresholds. And thresholds can be thought of as a point of no return, or a point from which return is a whole lot harder. So if we think about this little blue circle as our plant community at any given point in time at a site, it can kind of roll around along this, should have done this earlier, but it can kind of roll around along this hilly little line. And, you might have a range of plant communities in here for a while, something changes and you come over here. But the idea of a threshold is that, once you go over this point, you kind of fall off the cliff, if you will. It's either a whole lot harder or maybe not even possible to go back up compared to if you're just rolling around up here. So some people think about this as a point of no return. And I'm just going to pull up this crazy picture again just for a second and say that these thresholds, as those ecological site descriptions are being developed, they have a pretty good description of plant community dynamics, and we're trying to incorporate this idea of state and transition models, what you're looking at here. And please don't try to focus too much on the words. There's a lot of them. But, just as an example, for this ecological site, this up here is our kind of native, totally native plant community. And you cross a threshold going from that down to here. And this threshold is really the arrival of invasive exotic annuals. So it's worth thinking about. So everything we've talked about up to this point has been in the context of knowing your site, kind of what's the potential, what's the mix of plants and plant communities that I might be able to expect in my project area. But it hasn't yet told us what's on the ground now. And so knowing what's there now is also a very important part of knowing your site. And of course, figuring out what's there now can be done a lot of different ways. Everything from sampling the vegetation on the ground, looking at the actual plants on the site, to some form of remote sensing to see what's there. Okay, want to transition now into this idea that invasive annual grasses can hijack plant communities. So a lot of my colleagues are really good at coming up with these little short phrases that are catchy and memorable. Chad Boyd, who you heard from earlier, and I think you might hear from him again, had a great article recently, and he says, it's not 1850 anymore. And one of the things that he was referring to is 1850. We were pretty sure we didn't have any of these invasive annual grasses in our systems. Now it's different. You've probably also heard that invasive annual grasses changed the rules. Invasive annual grasses are hitchhikers and then backseat drivers. And I was talking to Brian last week, and he said, I think that's probably true. They start out as hitchhikers, then they become backseat drivers, but at some point they hijack plant communities. And so this reminded me, if you were paying attention to TV advertisements in the late 80s and early 90s, we heard about that. This is not your parents' Oldsmobile or grandparents' Oldsmobile. These invasive annual grasses, they were hitchhikers, rode in the back seat for a while. Then they hijacked the Oldsmobile, went to the performance shop, and then to the drag strip. So it's a whole different thing. It's not mom and dad's or grandma and grandpa's Oldsmobile anymore. And at this point, I just wanted to mention that, you saw a different form of the invasion curve earlier. Brian talked through this. We really do think of invasion as a process, and these invasive annual grasses do hijack plant communities and really limit what's possible or reasonable for us to do. And so early on, when there's not that many of these invasive species, you've got different opportunities than later. And that's really, an important point to think about with these invasive annual grasses hijacking plant communities. And just to, a reminder that all of this approach, thinking about ecology, is very consistent with this idea of defending and growing the core. So again, instead of just focusing over here in a way that may be reactive, expensive, and questionable in terms of success, at least spend some of your time thinking about what can we do over here to interact with the system earlier in the invasion process, where we might have an opportunity to do more proactive things, be more successful, and perhaps less expensive. All right, so at this point, we'll think just a minute about what it means for management, and this is directly related to what Claire was talking about with vectors. So we know Claire did a great job telling us about how invasive annual grasses grow and the importance of seeds for annual plants. And so one example of this might be to say, okay, where are the sources of invasive annual grass seeds in my landscape? Those are the yellow patches relative to the uninvaded areas that I'm wanting to protect. And how abundant are invasive annual grass seeds? So we'd be thinking about how many source areas they are, and then the size of those source areas. And then the next step is think about how those seeds are going to move in my location. So the heavy black line, we could say that's a road. So if we are worried about vehicles spreading invasive annual grass seeds, we'd want to think about that road. And then maybe you find out that livestock, wildlife, recreationists all move through this landscape following roughly that blue arrow. That might be another thing to think about. Sorry about that. And I want to point out here, I think I've got just a minute to do so, but the idea of growing and defending and growing the core doesn't mean you never work in some of these yellow areas. There may be things that you do to reduce the threat of seeds moving into your uninvaded areas that would be very wise to do. Okay, so disturbances don't have on-off switches, and so we see this from time to time, and you know, there's a tendency to say, man, if I could just remove this disturbance or that disturbance from the system, I could solve the invasive annual grass problem, and unfortunately, that is not the case. So disturbances don't have on-off switches. Disturbance is a part of these systems. It's always going to be there. And so we need to think more about managing disturbance and appreciating kind of more complexity in how they operate in these systems than reducing it down to the idea that you can turn them on and off. So I'm going to do this in a couple ways. I'm going to start out with one of my favorites, which is domestic livestock grazing. And the main factors that influence how livestock grazing affects rangeland systems are season, intensity, and duration of use. It's not just grazed and ungrazed, which often comes to people's minds. So for season, I just said spring, summer, fall, intensity, low, medium, high, duration, short, medium, and long. And there are 27 different possibilities of those factors. Now, granted, some of these don't make sense and aren't a reality, but if we say that half of them do, that's still 13 and a half different possible combinations, which is way more than two. And we haven't even yet started thinking about, you know, are we talking about sheep, goats, or cattle for domestic livestock grazing? And also appreciating the fact, and I believe it is a fact, that every piece of land, group of livestock, and the human managers involved, every combination of those three factors has the potential, at least, to differ from any other combination of those three factors. So it's a heck of a lot more nuanced than just grazed and ungrazed. Fire is similar, and you know, fire is memorable. There's a close association between fire and invasive annual grasses. Chad did a great job talking about this earlier. Here, I included all four seasons, three intensities, and extent being small, medium, or large, and there's 36 possibilities. Again, not all of them make sense. Some of those would drop out, but it's a heck of a lot more complex than burned and unburned. So resisting the tendency or the temptation to think about all we need to do is take fire out of the system and we've solved the invasive annual grass problem. Resist that line of thinking. Just like all we need to do is take livestock out of the picture and we solve the problem. Again, I encourage folks to resist that line of thinking. So on the idea of fire, great paper that came out, great analysis that's related to this. And I'll start with one of the main conclusions is, you know, sometimes we have gone too far and thought, oh, if we just manage fuels and prevent fire, we've got the invasive annual grass problem solved. And the conclusion from this paper was that, you know, fire is probably overemphasized as a driver of change. It darn sure catalyzes the conversion, but it's not absolutely required for invasion to happen. Okay, so nearly 80% of transitions to annual grass dominance in that period of time happened without fire in the 10 years prior. Okay, and I've got a little, we can come back to this later if we need to, but, you know, difference between dominance and annual grass monocultures might be part of why people look at this and they're like, huh? But anyway, just to make the point, and I think these authors are just encouraging us not to stop at the point of saying all we need to do is take fire out of the system and we've solved the problem. Okay, folks, with that, I want to just summarize quickly here. Ecology, it's all about the interactions. So leveraging ecology to defend and grow your core. I think we need to focus on plant communities, know your sites, appreciate the fact that invasive annual grasses hijack plant communities, and really resist the temptation to reduce disturbances to on-off switches. And with that, Thank you very much for your time and attention. And again, I wish I saw your faces, or I was looking at them now.
Thank you so much, Paul. We'll move now into the Q&A section of this session. The question I have is, invasive annual grass populations seem to be worse in some years than others. What weather conditions lead to particularly bad invasive annual grass years?
I'll start with the warm, dry summers. So a lot of these invasive annual grasses, well, cheatgrass, as Claire mentioned, is kind of our model. We've looked at that most closely. And we know with cheatgrass that after ripening period in the summertime is an important part of it. Usually we get that across the range. We tend to get those warm, dry seasons, and then fall. So technically, cheatgrass and these other invasive annual grasses that we're really looking at here are winter annuals. But we know that cheatgrass and maybe some of the others can also germinate in the spring. But having good moisture in the fall and spring to encourage the growth really helps. And then a true spring. So if it stays too cold and wet in the springtime, sometimes that'll slow down cheatgrass growth. But if you get that, most of us would think about it as a nice spring, then that would favor these invasive annual grasses. Maybe on the flip side, we see these really tough years, really droughty years are tough also for a lot of our invasive annual grasses. I went out, we were looking for sites for a cheatgrass study in two of the worst, most recent years, and it was darn hard to find cheatgrass. And so that can be tough for them too. Claire?
What a problem. I think people would be jealous of that. So, Claire, anything to add to that?
Yeah, I was just going to kind of say just like the timing with how much like rain we specifically got in Sheridan, Wyoming last summer, like the Ventonata was very behind in comparison to years prior. So kind of goes back to the whole thing of timing is incredibly important and it will vary from year to year depending on the weather.
Perfect. Next question we have is, what are the primary vectors for seed transportation?
I was going to say wildlife is probably a huge one. Cattle, livestock of any sorts. Just like your like trails and pathways can be a big vector pathway. And then I'd probably also say like vehicles and stuff like that as they're moving from place to place, specifically like, or also like horses, stuff like that too. Any sort of stock if you're taking those through rangelands that have any sort of invasive grasses, they can easily be a great way to transport. As well as also Brian put in the chat too, wind can specifically as well be another vector too, specifically when it comes to Ventonata.
And I was thinking about wind too. I mean, when I moved to Nevada 5 years ago, I got a new appreciation for these little dust devils, and those things I'm sure can move seeds of more than Ventonata. So.
Another question we've had come in is how to manage litter via fall grazing when lots of these annuals, are not desirable or palatable in that season. Would like more ideas on how the best way to manage litter would be.
That's a great question. And again, we know, I think, most about cheatgrass. And at least with cheatgrass, we have, the advantage that those seeds drop. And once those seeds drop, the acceptance of the standing dead goes way up. And the way to increase the palatability of that standing dead cheatgrass material is to provide a protein supplement. So animals that get plenty of protein, then they'll turn to that dry feed much more readily than if they don't. There's been a little work on some of the other grasses of how to increase palatability of, say, Medusa head and Ventonata, but we're not quite there yet. I mean, we can talk about this a little bit more this afternoon, I guess, if we're running short on time here, Erica.
And we've got a little bit more time. We've got about 10 minutes actually. We'll take a break at 11. So we're doing good.
Oh gosh. Okay. Well, then I'll just say real quickly, and we might say it later. The tough thing with the Medusa head, of course, is those long, stiff awns that tend to hang out for a while, and those are a kind of a physical um, um, hurdle, I'll say, to palatability. With respect to ventinata, well, both Medusa and ventinata have quite a bit of silica in them, and the silica in ventinata is pretty much a turnoff. And some recent work in Idaho on hay fields that were infested with ventinata, the acceptance of pretty darn good hay with ventinata in it was very low until they pelletized that hay. And so that's pretty extreme modification to the plant material to increase palatability, but that gives you an idea of how kind of unpalatable ventinata seems to be. And then, some folks that have worked with it in the Pacific Northwest um, have described and taken pictures of mouthfuls of ventinata that cattle have pulled out of the ground, and then they soon drop it right there. So you have these little tufts of ventinata where as soon as they got it in the mouth, they're like, no, thank you. So with those other invasive annual grasses, I guess we need to stay tuned. I'm not sure about increasing the palatability, other than maybe thinking of spring grazing if that's at all possible instead of the fall or dormant season.
Anything to add, Claire?
Nope, Paul summarized it perfectly.
Awesome. I know personally we've had some amount of luck in that early spring grazing of Medusa head, but it's a very short window from what we've seen. The next question we have here is, when thinking of an invasive species, you usually think of it outcompeting the natives due to a lack of predator or pathogens, et cetera. What factors are specific to invasive grasses that allow them to thrive as an invasive?
Claire, do you want to take that one?
I was going to say, my initial thought is just them even getting a jump start on the perennial species in the spring, like springtime, where the perennials are still not even up yet. You can then take in more water, stuff like that, to really help. And then once you're already going to seed and the other species haven't, I think that gives them a really competitive edge within that ecosystem.
Yeah, and people talk about invasive annual grasses being kind of pre-adapted to our systems, and I think that's true. And that it's pretty well accepted that if you weaken our native perennial grasses, we kind of open an opportunity for those invasive annuals to come in. And one of the ways historically that we weakened those plants was with the historic heavy grazing by livestock. And these invasive annual grasses, evolved thousands and thousands of years with some of the same animals that we use for domestic livestock production. So that is part of it. They do fine with the grazing that we have here. But I emphasized historic livestock grazing, not current, in that response. So.
How applicable is the cheatgrass annual cycle and the management opportunities graphic to other annual invasion or other invasive grasses? In particular, are these similar graphics for other major invasive annual grasses? Excuse me.
So thus far, we only have one for cheatgrass, but we can definitely consider making more, especially if people are finding them helpful. We can definitely do that. As for timing of things, it may be shifted. Like I said in my presentation, like cheatgrass is usually before ventinata and Medusa head within the season. They usually lag a little bit behind. So that would be kind of one of the differences when you're looking specifically at those graphics.
When can we group these invaders into an IGA versus when do we need to think about them as individual species? For instance, it seems like ventinata may be pretty different and that we may be able to revise our concepts of resistance and resilience in managing it. What are your thoughts from you experts here on that?
That's another fantastic question. So an easy answer is like what we've just been talking about with palatability differences and how that relates to tools how you might be able to use grazing, for example, to work with these things. And then with Ventonata here in northern Nevada, we are, well, maybe I should say I am really curious. I am honestly wondering how long it's been around, because there are areas where, and now I'm starting to think, where Ventonata has been for maybe even decades, and hasn't moved into the kind of the surrounding sagebrush grasslands as much as I would have guessed, because there's kind of this at the same time. So you have increased awareness of an invasive plant, increased vigilance looking for it, and then just the actual rate at which those grasses move through the landscape. And I don't know that there's any good way to really parse those three factors out. So I am wondering actually where Ventonata is going to end up in our native rangelands.
What type of utilization levels are we looking for in the winter and spring grazing to reduce the seed amount and allow available timing for perennial growth? If the growth overlaps with perennial bunch grasses, should we be promoting the grazing of the invasives at that time?
Great question. So I'll offer a couple of observations. So oftentimes the grazing of areas with a whole lot of these invasive annual grasses is being done to reduce fuel loads, and so the intensity, the utilization levels are pretty high. So they're taking a lot of that. And we have a trial going on, one of the study areas here that's related to a big project, big multi-state project, using spring grazing in these areas, which would, typically be the time when some of those cool season perennials are going to be susceptible. This is just circumstantial observations that were made at one of these study sites. The rancher that's involved in that sent me a picture of needle and thread, one of our native perennial bunch grasses, coming in on that site that they had grazed pretty hard in the spring for at least a few years in a row to get way down to these, low residual cheatgrass levels for a fire break. And he hadn't noticed the needle and thread out there before. He actually sent me a picture and said, "What is this?" So I think that goes back to the duration. They're hitting it hard with a higher number of animals for a short duration to get rid of the cheatgrass and allow the cool season perennial grasses to go ahead and do their thing.
Is there a hope of controlling this invasive species to the point where we would no longer have to apply herbicides, more like implementing a monitoring program to keep an eye on things rather than actively needing to control their herbicides and biological control options? And we'll end on this one.
I would love to see that day. I don't know if there's enough optimist in me. I'm not sure if we'll get there. I mean, we have such vast expanses of these, collectively of these invasive annual grasses. I think we're going to have to remain vigilant for a long time. There may be sites, if we can apply this strategic framework that we're talking about here effectively, I think there might be parts of the sagebrush biome where, we're pretty good. We've got it. But on the whole, I think we still need to remain vigilant. And one of my colleagues, I sometimes get in trouble for saying this. One of my colleagues has a quote that I just love. So Barry Perryman, he says, these invasive annual grasses aren't going to climb back on a boat and go back to where they came from. And that, I like it because it's like they're going to be here on the landscape somewhere. We're not going to get rid of all of them. And so there are going to be people throughout this biome that need to remain vigilant and watching for them.
Well, thank you everyone for all of the questions. You threw some hard ones at these two, but we appreciate your participation. Keep